Our guest speaker today is Dr. Roly Wettenhall. Roly is a professional historian, and his topic for discussion today is Victoria's Yellow Stain, the fleet of floating prisons. Some of you will know Roly from Mentone Grammar. Give him a big round of applause and welcome him to the club.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Everyone hear that off the back? Yeah. Thanks, bro. I won't start with the story I was going to start with, because I think the one I partially heard before the presentation on the Hubble telescope was as good as going to be. The way the laughter, I could hear the laughter from downstairs. Charles Dickens, many of you will have read, he wrote a lot about the times of the 19th century and even the 18th century. I just read one sentence. This is too small. It's a small screen. We saw the boat go alongside and we saw him taken up and disappear. Then the ends of the torches were flung hissing into the water and went out as if it were all over for him. This was magic, great expectations. He was taken onto a hulk. What was he taken onto? Prison hulks were a feature of the English prison system. I think you all have some understanding of that. And it was during the 18th and 19th century. And many of the transportees coming to Australia would have spent some of their time on the Thames, perhaps down to Southampton, in prison hulks. A lot has been written about Australia's transportees, the convicts who came here, but much less about prison hulks that we actually had here in Australia. Victoria specifically, had the largest fleet of prison hulks in the Empire outside of Great Britain. They had hulks because in 1775, with the War of Independence with fighting the US, they all of a sudden couldn't transport convicts to the US because the US was in fact a location where all convicted transportees were sent. It was a very common place, and they've got convict stations over there for you to look at if you want to go there. With the change, because of that, they decided that they had to do something else to improve the situation. Some of you might be aware they looked at using the west coast of Africa, where the British ships had been going down the Atlantic, and you getting too much feedback, or am I just okay? Yeah, right, okay. So they decided against Africa. Just the malaria, the diseases. I think it was perhaps going to impact on the guards of the prisons as much as the prisoners, so in fact they decided against that. They really had to look at a thing. They also had the reconstruction of Newgate Prison in London. In 1779 they basically gutted Newgate Prison, an infamous prison, and so they really had nowhere for people to go, prisoners to go. So they put them on hulks on the Thames and the Medway and wherever they could find places to hulk them, put the hulks. But of course, crowding people together, typhus, disease, all these sorts of things, and so they became infamous for being places where criminals would almost do anything not to be there. This is a Tom Roberts painting. Some of you may have seen it. When he exhibited this painting first in 1886 here in Melbourne, everyone who attended the exhibition would have instantly recognised what it was. It was a prison hulk. It was the Sacramento, which is one of the vessels that we will be talking about, and it lay on the river flats of the Yarra. For many, many years till it eventually rotted away and they had to cart away the pieces. In 2007, when it was last exhibited on a public scale, they found that everyone was asking a question. what's that vessel on the Yarra? We never saw that vessel on the Yarra. What was that vessel? No one knew anything about prison hulks. And so it's part to do with that story that I took this topic up as part of a minor thesis during my years. In Australia, prison hulks were little used. New South Wales had one called Phoenix during the 1830s. Again, they had an overcrowding issue they needed to fix, and so they had this vessel, Phoenix, and it was moored in Holt Bay. Now, does anyone know what Holt Bay, where Holt Bay is? No. Holt Bay, when they pulled the vessel away, the local community on the north shore overlooking Sydney Harbour, they decided that they could no longer be associated with something like that, so it's now Lavender Bay. Because Lavender Bay is just, so the odour of the hulks was dissipated by changing the name to Lavender. In Tasmania, where you may have had more, they only had one, and that was this one called the Anson. Now, I know I may go, but if I talk about a little bit about the features of it. So this was probably a two-master, probably a three-master vessel, not seafaring. But of course, there are no masts other than this one, which was just a signal mast. Why? Because if the prisoners took over the ship, they could sail away if it had masts. So they had to demast them. So there was no opportunity for the prisoners to go away. They always put a little hut there, and that is where punishment could be undertaken up on the deck. It was cover for the officers, etc. But that, if you see vessels like that anywhere today, there are a few still floating around, certainly in the West Indies. You recognise them for what they were made into. So the Anson, now this is an unreadable slide, but let me just give you an idea. So we've got the Anson there. You can actually see, I suppose, that there's four levels. There's a level there, which was totally underwater. There was a next level there. There's a next level there, and then there's this sort of upper level here. So what we're talking about, and down here, it's impossible for you to read, so bear with me, I'll talk through. But down here, that's below 100% below the waterline, and so prisoners, and these are little bunk beds all the way along, and so you could get 200 prisoners on this sort of vessel. So you had those below the waterline. These ones were partially below the waterline, that they were above, and that's the top deck. So the conditions would have been horrendous. Here, no light. They didn't have a way of getting light down to the very bottom at that time when the Anson was being given. So it's a thing. It famously became the accommodation for the women's factory down in Hobart. So I don't know, people, if you go to the Cascade Brewery, go along the valley there, you go past a site which is National Trust, I think, for Tasmania, and that's the women's, called the Women's Factory. And so they used to make clothing for the military and for seamen and that type of thing, so they were there just making. And each night they were taken back and put on this vessel for their accommodation. It would have been pretty ordinary. So, coming to Victoria, clearly the big event in Victoria, we all know 1850, 1851, 52, 53, this was the time of the gold rush. We had new arrivals. In 1852, 14,000 from New South Wales, 19,000 from Tasmania, 15,000 from other states, 1,000 from New Zealand. And I haven't even got the numbers for those coming from California, because California was starting to run out, and UK and Ireland, etc. So enormous, just enormous numbers. Melbourne had a jail. I should explain the difference between a jail and a prison. Melbourne jail, a jail is a temporary facility, so it might take people for 12 months, really at the most. So if you, for anything longer term, you went to prison. So you might get police cells, for instance, today, if you were overnight, that would be a jail. And then if you were sentenced to 5 years or whatever, you go to prison for that. So that's the difference between a jail and a prison. So the hulks, some of them were in fact just jails and others were prisons, but at the end of the day they just called them all prisons. So in Victoria we had the Melbourne jail. It held 400 people, and it was just not going to be adequate at all. You know, it was described in the, someone described Melbourne in a state of ferment. Drunken revelry held sway all hours of the day. The Argus, being the conservative newspaper, said crimes of the most fearful character and degree abound on all sides. The roads swarm with bush rangers, the streets with burglars and desperadoes of every kind. So there was this foment happening, people starting to agitate. If the Argus was saying something, certainly the politicians would have been listening to that. The other issue that occurred was in 1851, Victoria separated from New South Wales. Just as two separate colonies, not autonomous, but totally autonomous, but we separated. And of course, what was happening, the only prison available if you committed a crime in Victoria or Port Phillip was that you were sent to a prison in New South Wales, and that was Cockatoo Island. So Cockatoo Island was a prison for long-term prisoners, and so if you committed a crime here, you were sent up to Cockatoo Island. With the separation from New South Wales, because the New South Wales government in fact didn't want to be funding all that, so an answer had to be found as to what to do with the prisoners down here. I'm sort of just conscious of time, so I'll just keep moving. So the first thing, because of this influx that was coming from New South Wales, the government here, after 1851, when we sort of had a government, legislative council, it decided to do two things. One, it tried to bring in a Convict Prevention Act, which basically said that if a ship's captain brought a convict here to Victoria, he would be fined. And of course, it was a bit like, this also occurred with China, the influx of Chinese. Ship's captains could be fined if in fact they brought Chinese in. Well, of course, the Chinese realised that they could just go to Adelaide and walk overland. That's how they did it. The prisoners from New South Wales, they just decided to walk down basically where the Hume Highway is, walk down and over the Murray and came into Victoria anyway. So that obviously didn't work. It was a total failure. They had no way of doing it, looking after it. Here's to do with the growth of conviction rates in Melbourne, and this is the problem they were facing. So we've got in 1850 the population of Victoria, we'll just we call it Melbourne, which is essentially Victoria, 76,000. 3 years later it was 222,000, which is just an enormous increase. And the number of convictions had gone up from 111 to 678. And the increases each year were just astronomical. So we're talking of a small town here, so it's really causing a lot of grief. The critical issue is the percentage of convictions to the population. So back in 1850 it was 0.14, now it's 0.3. So the number of convictions relating to the size of the population was increasing exponentially as well. So you had this desperate increase. So the first thing that they decided to do was to build stockades. Pentridge, in fact, has always been a site. It was a village. Pentridge was a village out on the road to Sydney, into New South Wales, and so they decided to build a stockade. Now this is for prisoners of criminals. So what have we got here? We've got little wooden structures. We've actually got a stockade fence that's probably maybe 4 feet high. That's just another view of it at the time. But so bottom line, the prisoners jumped the fence. They were just escaping. So the Pentridge one just didn't work. They had to then build more stockades, so they built stockades at Richmond, Williamstown, Collingwood, but essentially they built them all the same way. They were log stockades, and it just wasn't going to work. And so the issue became so difficult that the long-term prisoners, people who had to be in prison, were sent back to, they started sending them back to New South Wales. And so this is, if you've been to Sydney, you go to Cockatoo Island. That's the old jail on Cockatoo Island, which took up that's sort of the space that you see now, and the rest of it's obviously naval, I think, isn't it? So they still didn't have an answer. What were they going to do? So they looked at the experience elsewhere. Jeffrey Blaney has estimated that in 1851, on some days, there were 250 empty vessels sitting up there in Hobson's Bay. It was just a plethora of ships just rocking idly by. Why were they there? Because they had nowhere to go. They had no crews. The crews had come, the vessels had come to Melbourne with goods, had come with passengers, had come with whatever, and no matter what the captains did with the very small police force that might have been floating around, the crew all deserted and to go seeking gold. So you had all these vessels just sitting there. So it became a decision to say, well, look, we'll create some floating prisons. So they advertised. Again, I apologise for being small, but the essence is, so this was an advertisement, and it was looking for vessels that must have a poop, which is up on the top deck, top gallant forecastle. Height between decks must be 6'6", at least 6'6", well ventilated, sound in the hull, copper must be in good condition, etc., etc. And so they advertised for the vessels. That's hard to see, but that's a painting that's in the State Library. You can go and see that. And so they gazetted for this. Subsequently, they took up two vessels straight away. They had the President and the the Deborah. Subsequently, they brought in the Success, the Sacramento, and the Lysander. So we ended up with 5 vessels. In having these vessels, so there's a contemporary painting in 1853. The important thing about these vessels was that they in fact were painted yellow. This is a lithograph that hasn't survived the yellow, but there is a white hull, if you like, and there's another one. So this is after the first two were there, the President and the Deborah. They were placed in Hobson's Bay in a triangulation with the church in Williamstown, which is St Paul's, is it? I think it might be. So it has a huge steeple. You might know the Anglican church in Williamstown. And it triangulated across the bay to a point, and then there was another one. And so there was a point, an area in which other vessels weren't allowed to be within 200 yards of the hulks. That doesn't look like it's happening, but that's what the law wants anyway. That's a more contemporary painting, although it's not contemporary, it's modern. It wasn't contemporary at the time, but in fact that's what they look like. So going back to what we were talking about before, no masts. You've got your little building on the poop deck, and very, very visible, and no one allowed to go near it. The first vessel was the President, and in a sense it's not the most famous, but it was the most important for the authorities, because this was a hulk that was for the long-term prisoners. Not the long-term, the most, those with the greatest crimes, if you like. So if you weren't being hung for murder, which of course you were in those days, you would be sent to the President. And needless to say, the President had a very deep underwater area with absolutely no light at all. And the conditions there just got worse and worse. They talked about the President, people unable to escape from the President. We believe that was the case, that no one ever did. Some did escape from some of the hulks, but we think the President, in fact, was no one escaped from it. And it was labelled a punishment hulk. And of course, the punishment was to do with the conditions in which they were kept, the food that they were given, and also really the brutality of the guards who looked after them. They actually had no sympathy at all for the prisoners. On some of the other hulks where the crimes were lesser or they were there for another reason, it perhaps wasn't as brutal, but the President covered every bit of brutality that you might want to think of. So when you were convicted of a crime, depending on the seriousness of it, so if you were convicted for an 8-year sentence, which really wasn't for anything specific, it might be for habitual horse stealing, might go to 8 years. You had a year on the President being the punishment hulk. You then went on to a probationary hulk for 2 years. The success, we'll come to that vessel in due course. Then you would if you got through that and had been the model prisoner, you would then go on to a land stockade. So they kept the Williamstown stockade going, they beefed it up, etc. So to get your ticket of leave, because you still could get remission, parole if you like, I think we'd call it today, so you actually had to serve 6 years. So you had 1, 2, 3, giving you 6 years before you could get a ticket of leave to have some remission. If you were on a 15-year sentence for something significant, you had 3 years on the President, which is really unimaginable. 5 years on the success, and then 4 years on the stockade. The President here, on the President, you never left the vessel. Okay, so on the success, you would leave the vessel. You may be working doing hard labour at Williamstown, breaking up the basalt. If you go down to Williamstown, you see a lot of basalt. There's a basalt quarry there at Williamstown. So they were breaking all that up, and for masonry and buildings, foundations of buildings all around Melbourne, sea walls, etc. We all know how common basalt was used in Melbourne, and basically you had to serve 12 years out for remission, and you got a 1/5 remission for a serious crime. So it was quite severe, without a doubt. The men who ran these establishments, the superintendents of penal establishments, some were good men, and others, one in particular, was the bastard of all time. Many of you will have read Marcus Clarke's Natural Life, or we call it now the term is Natural Life, sent off to Norfolk Island. The Commandant on Norfolk Island, an absolute brute of a man. It was virtually a biography of John Price. That was his job. He was the Commandant on Norfolk Island, and after he was taken off there because of the brutality there, he was put in charge of the hulks here in Victoria. He became the superintendent of penal establishments. But it was during this time, his predecessor, John Champ, he said we needed one prison to be built here in Melbourne for everyone. And in fact, that was the original suggestion and he suggested Pentridge, and we know in due course, after the hulks were decommissioned, that Pentridge jail went up there. There were 80 men in total on the President. They were never allowed off. They had 1 hour a day out of their cells. It was very difficult to control, and it only lasted for 7 years. So because of the sheer brutality of it all. The next vessel was the Deborah. The Deborah only held 5 criminals, but the rest of the 100 plus that were on it were refractory seamen. So when a vessel came into Melbourne, and this still can happen, the master of the vessel might go to the superintendent of penal establishments and say, I've got a seaman on board, he's broken XY rules, I've deemed that he needs to be incarcerated for 6 months, 12 months, whatever his ruling would be. And that was the power of the captains of ships in those days. And so the seaman would be offloaded, put onto the Deborah, and he would serve out his time. In the meantime, his vessel sailed away, of course, so many of them were effectively just stuck here at the end of the day. So that was the main reason for the Deborah. But of course, the government being no different to every government, they saw a revenue opportunity here. These people weren't necessarily criminals. They'd done something, you know, probably punched the first officer or something like that. So the government hired them out to load and unload the vessels that were in port. So the Deborah was just there. They would be rowed to a vessel, they would be unloading, they might have worked on the wharf and that type of thing. And so the government charged the ship's handlers and the chandlers, all this sort of thing, for the services of these seamen who were being held. And they were getting good money for it. So look, by 1855, the intensity of the gold rushes had started to diminish, as I think we all knew, and so the numbers coming in were becoming, were dropping in a sense. Melbourne was still expanding, but it was dropping. So they decided to use the refractory seamen on the Deborah for even other uses. So they would be hired out to vessels as cooks, whatever they could be, and it gave them a chance to, just as I say, earn revenue. By about 1864, here in Melbourne, we've had the influx of people seeking gold. People have settled down. What starts to happen? You've got poverty starts to become rampant in Melbourne in the 1860s, with people unsuccessfully prospected. When you get people, you get children, and so we had urchins just running around the city. And so the government set up 2 industrial schools, what they called industrial schools. These were just places of brutality, I think, reading it between the lines. But there was one on Princess Bridge that was for girls, and the Deborah was converted into a vessel for holding neglected children, neglected boys, and eventually that became a scandal in itself, and the vessel was decommissioned. The next vehicle I just want to talk about is perhaps, for me, a really interesting vessel. It was the Lysander. The Lysander was an East Indiaman vessel, and when the news of the separation of Victoria from New South Wales was being sent, of course the decision was in the United Kingdom, so a vessel had to bring the news, if you like, and it was the Lysander that brought the news. And it docked first in Adelaide, and as it came round, and the news leaked a little bit in Adelaide, but really only it was the authorities who knew that officially that the separation had been approved. When the ship docked in Melbourne, it pulled up and they rang the ship's bell for a very long time. They just kept ringing the ship's bell, and of course the news spread like wildfire here in Melbourne. And within 24 hours on Flagstaff, on the hill on Flagstaff Gardens there, you know, you had proclamations being read. Within days they were having fireworks all over the lower part of Melbourne, etc. And it was a monumental celebration. The army, as such as it was, they paraded, and it was seriously just an extraordinary time. They had celebrations whereby the shops up Collins Street and Burke Street, they would have transparencies in their windows with lights behind them. So this is how you can walk past shops and see what was happening. Well, they had transparencies of the Lysander, and they had transparencies of all sorts of things to celebrate this separation from New South Wales. And so, as they say at the time, the news was peeled on the ship's bell, and it was a huge event. The Lysander was then, it stayed, it hadn't sailed away when in fact there was a ship came into Port Phillip Bay, I get this wrong every time, Ticonderoga. Some of you may be aware of the Ticonderoga. It came into the heads.
The Death Ship?
Death Ship, exactly right. So it came into the heads, and it had to have its yellow flag flying because the vessel was just full of people, I think typhus. And there were over 300 sick people on board. The vessel couldn't handle all that. There was no quarantine station built at that stage. So the Lysander, which had troops on it at the time, it was sent down to the heads, and it became the second vessel which housed all these people. And so many of them died, 170 out of about 300. So it was an enormous death rate, whatever. But as soon as it had finished being a hospital vessel, they decided it would become another hulk and be used for prisoners. It was used for daily work. It was really just like a probation vessel, a bit like the Success. And they were employed as carpenters and masons and shoemakers and tailors. There were bakers and cooks and servants and writers and all sorts of things. But in 1860, the Lysander was decommissioned. Now, I sort of skipped over a little bit. Why is it important? Because this is where I think the story gets a little interesting anyway. The ship's bell, which had peeled the news for coming, the ship's bell was transferred to Pentridge Prison and to be rung to ring the hours in the prison. And for whatever reason, I'm not quite sure, but they decided they didn't want to use it. And soon after, it was transferred to the Coburg Fire Station, which I think is about over the road from the prison. And so the Fire Brigade Fire Station used it until 1921, when it was gifted to the MCG. And what was it used for at the MCG? Quarter time, final time. And they rang the Lysander bell at the end of every quarter, so they didn't have sirens, so it was a bell. And so it was the Lysander bell that was rung until 1956. Of course, when Melbourne had to modernise, being with the Olympics, we had to show how modern we were. We couldn't ring a bell for all these things. So they installed a siren in the MCG, and the Lysander bell was gently retired. And you can go and see it today in the Cricket Museum, in a corner. It's on an iron frame, so that the black bit at the top is part of the iron frame. And so the bell today is still called Old Lysander, and it sits in the Cricket Museum, and it's in a corner. It's just a piece of history which I think which is great. The next, the Sacramento. The Sacramento was really was a revenue earner for the government. It was, most of the time in its life, it was moored along the coast between Melbourne and Geelong. And in fact, if you're coming into Geelong, you've come all the way, people might know where the Bunnings, if you're coming into Geelong, the Bunnings on the right-hand side, and you go down in a big dip. Well, that dip before coming up to the carpet factory, past the Ford factory, is Cowie's Creek. If you take Cowie's Creek out to the bay, it was actually moored at the outlet of Cowie's Creek for quite a long time. And what was it used for? It was used for building the railway. The labour was used for building the railway line between Melbourne and Geelong. And so the government did very well on hiring out the 1 to 200 people who were on the Sacramento. the Sacramento, when the railway line was finished, there were no other major projects available. It was brought back up to Melbourne, and at the time where the Eastern Market used to be, where the Southern Cross used to be, for those who don't know the history, the Southern Cross was built on a thing called the Eastern Market, about the size of the Victoria Market, but it was huge. Before the Eastern Market was built, was a female jail, and they wanted to get the women out of the city, and so they put them on the Sacramento. So it was used as a female jail for quite a while, because needless to say, the scandals didn't take long to break out with having men guards with these women, etc. So the story is not a pretty one there. It was the last hulk that was used, and it was retired off in the mid 1870s. What it was then was moored in the Yarra. And about that time, we had the Victorian Navy being built. Now, you don't have the advantage, but I'm looking out at the major vessel of the Victorian Navy, which was HMVS, whatever it was, Cerberus. And as well as having that vessel, as well as firing whatever it fired from the huge guns, which shattered the windows up in St Kilda when they tested it. It was also a store point for what they called torpedoes, which were basically water-based bombs, quite frankly, and also early types of mines. And they needed more space than Cerberus would have, so they used the Sacramento to store, and they called it a torpedo ship at the end of the day. We actually had a part of the Victorian Navy called the Torpedo Corps, and so they were in charge of it. The last vessel, and the vessel that in fact lasted the longest out of all of this, was the Success. Now, if we went back before, the Success was the one after the President. What can you say about the Success? The Success was decommissioned in the late 1870s. And it just floated around. But some entrepreneurial blokes in Sydney decided they could do something with this vessel. So they purchased it in 1891 from the Victorian government. And what they did is that they fitted it out as what they thought a prison hulk should have in it. And so they had torture equipment. They had all sorts of things that, in fact, were unlikely ever to have been used. But they then sailed it up to Brisbane, back down, and so it did a national tour. So in doing this national tour, they went broke. But not to be that, another group purchased it and took it to the United Kingdom, and similarly toured it around. Where it had its name, the Success, best, was in the Chicago World Trade Exposition in 1932. And it was a huge embarrassment for the Australian government, because here was, obviously I don't know what we had, but I'm assuming Australia had a lovely exhibition at the World Trade Exposition, as we always do, and here moored in the, what must have been the Erie, would it be, on the Lake where Chicago is, was this vessel representing what happened to criminals in Australia. And the government tried everything to get the US government to pull the vessel so it wouldn't be, and it was considered to be a great shame on our nation that everyone else could see it. We petitioned the US government to have it stopped, but by that time, literally millions had seen it. Just about everyone who went to the Chicago exhibition, apparently, that was one of the draw cards, and they just wanted to go over it. So it was really difficult. The vessel, 32, the vessel was then owned privately, and in 1946 there was a fire on board, and it burnt to the waterline in Port Clinton in Ohio. might do, I'm just conscious of time. Yeah. What I'll do, I'll just tell you a bit more about the success. Let me go through. Yes, okay. Sorry, wrong way. Right, so I'll just return. So this is 1885. So these are the hulks, the Deborah behind and the Sacramento at the front, just rotting away on the flats of the Yarra, which puts it down almost down near Coot Island. People know the Yarra, so it was just near Coot Island. And I was at a conference only maybe a few years ago, and met some archaeologists, and they had just been looking for the remnants of these vessels, and they found wood, but they didn't know which vessel they were from. So that was where the Deborah and the Sacramento ended up. This is the success, and this is the success as it had been purchased and by businessmen and taken. This was in Sydney while it was doing its tour of tour of the nation. So what they did is that they brought exhibits on board, and this catalogue, you can go and find this catalogue at the State Library and of what they did. So you paid to go on board, and they had this catalogue of things. They built cells downstairs, down underneath and below deck, and they said this is really what it was. They had these bars, they didn't exist, and here we go, sorry. Okay, so that was it was called the Great Hoax, and taking it back to slideshow.
Turned it off.
Yeah.
That's still the lighthouse at Williamstown now,
Yeah.
that one there.
So that's the time ball at Williamstown. For those that don't know the time ball in Williamstown, it was available for ships to know when noon was. My understanding it was only used for noon. Does anyone know more about the time ball? I think it was only noon.
Yes, yeah, I think you're right.
Right. And so the ball would drop at noon every day. So there's a ball that's there, and they would take it up there, and they would drop at noon every day. So that's out down at Williamstown. You see these things are all made from basalt. Everything in Williamstown is made from basalt, and a lot of it would have been carved by the convicts. Down there they have this anchor. They really don't know which vessel it's from. I don't think they actually say. It was used by one of them, so I don't really know which vessel that one came from. But that's the hoax. How am I going for time?
I think we're just about done.
Just about done?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just think. Look, you might wonder what the community reaction to hoax was. It really did divide Melbourne. There were those that wanted prisoners out of sight and out of mind. And so the hoax served that. But they did become a bit of a more celeb. There was a bushranger here in Melbourne, Victoria, various names, but we all knew him as Captain Melville. Some people may have heard the name Captain Melville, Francis Melville. He was up before for the judge, Molesworth, Robert Molesworth, and for bushranging. And he was sentenced to 32 years hard labour. And he said, Melville replied, "I hope to die a young man, but I'd rather meet 10 deaths than such a life as the one I have in prospect," because he knew he was going to spend as much time as they would give him on the president. And but he ended up escaping after success, and he was recaptured, and he was sentenced to death. Now, the thing about Melville is that he never used a solicitor or a lawyer in his defence thing, and so when he was had been recaptured and he was back before Judge Mulder, he decided to tell his story of what it was like on the Hulk, and it was a sensational story. If you ever want to read it, go on Trove. Some of you know what Trove is. Go and find the newspapers, especially the Argus and the Age of the time in the 1856, 56 onwards. Melville just had an amazing story. Let me just look. He really talked about the barbarities that went on. You know, he talks about Price, the evil commandant, if you like, from Norfolk Island. He would bait prisoners to do something wrong, like hand out tobacco. He would ensure that there was tobacco on board, and then he would search the vessel. Whoever had the tobacco, they were then convicted for more time and also punished. And the punishments were absolutely horrendous. Cold baths and being dragged under the keel were the types of things. But they also invented. There was one particular one that Melville just described where they scrubbed out one man's anus with sand grit. It's just man's humanity to man. It is just defiant. And so these sorts of things became really one of the reasons why the Age became such the great newspaper that it became in the sense of its longevity, etc. The Argus was the newspaper of the Conservatives, the Legislative Council, the upper house, if you like. The Age, it represented the people, and its great support base was in the Legislative Assembly, where all the common man, if you like, voted for people in the Legislative Assembly. And the Age particularly ran the campaign to get rid of these hulks and to get rid of this barbarity that was occurring in Melbourne. Look, I think I can leave it there.
Thank you.
Some questions? Anyone?
Is Port Jackson still there in Sydney?
Port Jackson?
Yeah, what's it being used for now?
Sorry, Port Jackson's the whole harbour of Sydney.
Yes. No, the centre there that you had a picture of.
Cockatoo Island.
Cockatoo Island, sorry.
Cockatoo Island's a naval base, isn't it, I think?
Naval base.
Yeah, so that's its major use. It's still owned by the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And you can go out there and by some little ferry or means and go around the ruins of the prison, but it's most of it, I think, is cut off being naval base.
Naval base.
Submarine base.
Gentlemen, put your hands up, please. Here we go.
Any remnants of the Ankole Hobart still left down there?
No, there's nothing. The only vessel that was a hull was the Anson, and no, there's nothing there. A lot of these, some of them, they just burn them to get rid of the disgrace. They did burn them to the water line, and they just
Be a great bonfire.
Pardon?
Be a great bonfire.
Great bonfire. Yeah.
Any more? Gentlemen? We
No, all right.
should have mislaid the microphone at the moment, so anyone else would like some questions for Roly, please?
Okay, look, I'm here for lunch.
I'd like just to make a quick comment, and Roly, you see what you think about this. Fabulous talk, very interesting, and a total disgrace to this state that we don't know anything about this fabulous history that this state had and what this state has done for ourselves. It's just, I can't believe it, and as a historian I'm sure you'd agree with me on this one, Roly, that we don't, nobody knows these things. It's disgrace.
Yeah, look, it's and it's going to get worse. I'm looking at a generation of people who did history at school. Without a doubt, I'm sure all of you did history at school. That is no guarantee today. And you've got history schools. I'm part of the history school up at Melbourne University on a part-time basis. But there are subjects being dropped. I don't get casual work as a teacher anymore, not even tutoring, because you've got professors now tutoring and marking papers. And the curriculum, we've got a new history curriculum. based on a national curriculum down to a state curriculum, and it is, the focus on Victoria is just lost. And it is tough, but look, we've got the Royal Victorian Historical Society, Royal Historical Society, Victoria at least, a fabulous organisation up in Becker Street, always got exhibitions on, but it is a difficult exercise.
Some of you may also remember from a little talk I gave a while ago that great-grandfather Henry Rushworth was the third officer on board the prison. Nothing that I should be really proud of. And I will get John Green, where are you, John, to come up and thank Roly for his fabulous presentation.
I'm
There he is, coming around the
sorry, you told me that 12 months ago. I'm sorry I didn't
That's
weave
all right.
didn't weave it in properly.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's all right. We'll let that one.